Thank you very much for asking me today. I'm aware that it's not my destiny I'm talking about here because I'm not an African, but I like to tell stories of the Africans I meet in the 16 years I've been writing about the continent, and I hope that they have resonance beyond the people that I focus on. And I think they do, because I get a lot of emails and messages from people saying, if you only change the names, this could be our country. And those messages come from Zambia and South Africa and Nigeria and Sudan. And the story that I really wanted to tell today is how the West, with the very best of intentions, I think often ends up fostering corruption in parts of the world that it likes to think it's helping. And it does so because it's fallen in love with this seductive myth called economic growth at any costs. And I'd like to start by describing a scene. It's an event that took place a couple of years ago in Kenya, which used to, until fairly recently, be considered an African success story. And it took place in Nairobi, in the capital, on the 15th floor of the finance ministry, which is a skyscraper slap bang in the business center. It was in the evening, it was when rush hour was underway, and there was a meeting going on with the finance minister of Kenya of the day, and he was meeting the justice minister and a big bulky third man, and they were engrossed in that kind of talk that's so intense that you don't really want to have secretaries around to listen to it. And at a certain stage, the big third man rushes up, he jumps up and rushes off to the loo, and the other two don't really notice. But there is a good reason for why he's done that, and he's done that because, in fact, during the whole of this discussion, this very intense discussion, he had a microphone hidden underneath his shirt, and he was taping them secretly. And the tape recorder had suddenly switched into play mode. Not what you want if you're trying to tape a conversation. And it was going to expose him as a sneak and a spy. I just wanted to show a picture of the man. I hope that will come up. This is a picture I took myself. It's John Githongo, of course. And this is him and me in London having a cup of coffee together in Camden Town. And up until February 2005, John Githongo was the anti-corruption czar, as many of you will know, of Kenya, and he was working in the office of the president, briefing President Mwai Kibaki about corruption. And that was the closest moment he came up until then to being discovered when the tape recorder switched into play. But he had been doing this for a while. He had been taping conversations. He had then been going home, downloading them, encrypting them on his computer, sending them abroad to trusted friends. And he'd also been collecting a lot of documentation, secret documents that implicated certain people in government. And he was doing this thanks to a network of informers in government, people who were very concerned about what was going on, who were working within the government departments. And he was building up this cache of evidence. So the question really is, what makes somebody like this, who has such a trusted, important job, resort to these kind of underhand tactics, cloak and dagger tactics of the spy, and doing something that many of his contemporaries he knew would regard as completely despicable. And I think you have to be desperate to do this. And you also have to feel that something you believe in extremely profoundly is being betrayed. And I think that the issues raised by what happened to John and his whole story, which I tell in my book, are not isolated to Kenya. They are relevant to many African countries, because the problem of corruption is such a key one now. For many years, Western governments became convinced by the likes of Bono and Geldof and Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, that the issue when it came to aid to Africa was how much could you give, and that they should give more and more and more. And I think, what I've become convinced of working on Africa more and more myself is that it's not how much money you raise, it's how you reach the people who need it. How do you get that money to the people who need it? And that's a really, really difficult question to answer. And I don't think we know the answer to it. But just to go back and talk a bit about John. I met him in the 1990s. I was a journalist working in Nairobi. I was working for the Financial Times. And these were the days of Daniel Arap Moi, where sleaze really had become such a massive problem. It permeated every deal, every ministry. Growth had plummeted. The country was stagnating. Nobody wanted to lend money to Kenya. And John was a journalist, and he later became the head of Transparency International, the anti-corruption group, and did some great campaigning work there. And when the opposition won the elections in 2002, it was sort of obvious that he would be the person they would appoint, a new government which had sworn that it would drive out corruption and deal with this problem, and sweep out the Augean stables, that they would appoint him as their anti-corruption czar. And I think a lot of Kenyans felt that appointment was very typical. A great, wonderful, peaceful revolution had taken place. And it was part of a general trend across Africa. Anti-corruption units were being set up, anti-corruption directors appointed. Western donors were really behind this trend. They backed, in theory, they backed these units to the hilt. And one of the big decisions he had to take was whether his work was going to be ethnically sensitive. Because what you've had in Kenya, and you've had it in many of the African countries I've worked in, is a rotating system of tribal elites, where if you belong to the right community at the right time, there's a feeling that your community has won the right to eat. And I'm told in Nigeria this would be the right to chop. So the phrase is not just, I mean, the phrase is used across East Africa, it's our turn to eat. But I mean, it's one that I think a lot of countries recognize. And the idea is, yeah, we're going to steal if you're the minister concerned, but, you know, and you're going to see conspicuous spending on my part and my wife's part, and she's going to go shopping in Manhattan and Harrods, and I'm going to buy lots of villas in town. But it's okay, it's justifiable because it's for the community. It's for us. It's our turn. And, you know, you're going to benefit jobs for the boys in the civil service, contracts for our guys, investment in the constituency. And let's be honest, this dates back way before independence. I mean, it dates back to the way white settlers ran Kenya too for the white community. But it was then something that Jomo Kenyatta took on, the first president. It was then perpetuated by Moi, and it went from being the Kikuyus doing that to the Kalenjins doing that. And then with Mwai Kibaki, the question was whether or not there was going to be a shift back to the Kikuyus. And John, the really interesting thing about John, of course, is that he is a Kikuyu, and he went to school with a lot of the people who were now the ministers or in key positions and who were effectively running the country, making the key decisions. And his really interesting decision, and it says so much about him and also the generation he comes from, was that not only was he not going to give the Kikuyus a soft ride, he was going to focus on them in particular when it came to investigating corruption. And I think this is because of that generation wanting to do things in a different way, and also who he was. He's a very religious, very idealistic man, and he found this whole phrase of, it's our turn to eat. He actually found it disgusting. So he began to hear rumors of a new scandal. It was called Anglo-leasing. I won't go into the details, but it was $1 billion worth scandal involving 18 military and security contracts. And he began to have conversations with ministers, like the Justice Minister, like the Finance Minister, who was saying, listen, this is our guys. You know, don't investigate. Don't think about probing this. This is us. You know, this is the community. Keep quiet. He began to get death threats. And finally, he fled. And he came to my flat in London. He resigned from there. I ended up faxing his resignation to State House, which was a nervous moment in my life. And then he had to decide what to do. And he really had every reason to keep quiet. I mean, you would, wouldn't you? You know, you've got a girlfriend back home. You've got family back home. You've had a very nice job and a villa. And, you know, just keep quiet, let it blow over, and then go back later on. He didn't do that. Instead, he did something typical of him. He became a whistleblower, and he leaked the story. And he did it in a very high-tech way. He used the internet. he put the tapes that he had recorded on the internet, which I think shows you how the new technology can play a really important role in this kind of thing. And the impact was extraordinary in Kenya. Ministers were being chased down corridors by journalists with mics saying, "You are going to resign, you are going to resign," not something people were used to seeing. The American ambassador described the impact as like a piano falling out of the sky. But just to get to the crux here, the long-term impact was really pretty muted. One of the ministers involved in that scandal is still a minister, although he's got a different docket. A few people stepped aside. There have been no prosecutions to date. And amazingly, Western funding for Kenya continued notwithstanding, sending out a really very clear and explicit message to the government of what would be tolerated and what we wouldn't really make too much of a fuss over here in the West. And I think that's because there is a tradition in the West of seeing corruption as distasteful, but it's basically trivial. It's worth tolerating if that government can deliver growth. And after years of negative growth under Moi, the Kibaki government was delivering growth. It was delivering 6% growth, which is pretty good by Kenyan standards. Not quite good enough, but pretty good. And development officials, people who work for DFID and the World Bank and the IMF and the EU, they looked at those figures and they felt a warm glow. And what they sort of forgot about was the key issue, which is who was benefiting from those 6% growth rates. Was everyone benefiting equally? And did they feel that way? Did all the different ethnic communities feel they were benefiting equally? And what you get in Kenya in 2007 was the end of complacency amongst the donors. And I think people suddenly realized that there was an intrinsic link between corruption of that nature, which goes right to the top of a government and involves key ministers and is being tolerated by the president of the day, and the violent implosion of an African state that up until then had seemed to be a sort of a safe destination. Because the Kibaki government not only felt it could get away with Anglo-leasing, it also felt it could get away with rigging the elections. And when that began to happen, and was very clearly beginning to happen, Kenya exploded into violence, which for those of us who've covered the post-Rwandan period was all too familiar in the shape it took. And here are just a few. These were taken by a friend of mine, and they're not the most gruesome pictures, as I'm sure many of you will appreciate. These were the most violent elections in Kenyan history, and the country came very close to a civil war. And I think what you've seen in Kenya today is an agonizing process of self-examination. And it resulted in a new constitution being passed, whose impact we don't yet know. Everyone's really hoping that it's going to make a massive difference. I'm not convinced that Western donors and aid organizations have gone through the same learning process as Kenyans, though. It's true that in Kenya, the donors now are very, very wary of directly funding the government. And they're becoming increasingly aware of just how much money is being stolen, especially money that was meant to be spent on the education of poor children, most recently. But if you look across the region, if you look at Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, regimes where journalists are assassinated, NGOs have been closed down, elections are rigged, constitutions are sabotaged, opposition leaders are murdered or go into exile, they're still getting lashings of support from Western countries. And this is most surprisingly, perhaps, given that we have a massive recession taking place here, and people in Britain are obsessed with the cuts that they're facing here in their own ministry budgets. I think there are two good reasons for this. I'm not going to go into the detail here because it's a short talk, but one is obviously strategic. The West now is realizing it's increasingly non-influential. It's being overtaken by China. It doesn't really matter very much what the West says when you have your own oil resources, as Uganda now does, as Ethiopia probably will have very soon. And people like President Paul Kagame and Meles Zenawi and Yoweri Museveni are willing to send troops to do the work that Western armies don't want to do, and the West is very aware of that. those troops are in Somalia and Darfur. But I think the other reason, to go right back to what I was saying at the beginning, is that the donors remain in thrall to this notion of the miracle of growth. And that if you have growth, economic growth, you're reaching the poorest of the poor, and therefore any other failings on the human rights front, on the governance front, on the corruption front, should be and can be overlooked. And you see this argument being made. I was even shocked to see it on the blog of a World Bank chief economist. And it's very interesting to me that everyone swallows the line that Ethiopia, for example, is delivering 11% growth rates. But this is also an administration that claimed to have delivered 99.6% victory for the ruling party in the recent elections. And yet we still think that these figures, are completely valid and credible. So there's no doubt about it. Here in the West, we have to look very closely at our own record of the kind of companies that operate in Africa. And increasingly, there are more and more prosecutions being made, which is very encouraging. And Transparency International in the UK keeps a log of those and has moved Britain from being, I think it was in the passive category to the active category. So we are beginning to look at our own record here in the West. But we do need to look in a more fundamental way as well. I think we need to stop turning a blind eye to what favored regimes get up to, arguing that as long as they deliver growth, it doesn't matter too much what patronage systems they run or what human rights they violate because they're reaching the poorest of the poor. The fact is they're not, and we cannot jump over the heads of those administrations and make sure that that money reaches the people who deserve it most. I think we need to be combative and challenging in our relationships with those kind of regimes, because John is not the only anti-corruption chief who ended up on the run. He is back now in Kenya, but there are other people who've come a cropper trying to do the same work that he did. Maxwell Nkole in Zambia. Nuhu Rubadu is now back in Nigeria running for the presidency, but he also had his time in exile. Sierra Leone's anti-corruption chief, I believe, has recently resigned. South Africa's had his task force wound up. It's not an easy job to do, and it would be good if the donors didn't undermine the task that those people are trying to do. And I'm just closing. This is a picture taken by David Levine. He's a Guardian photographer, and he went in and did a project in Kibera slum, which is one of, I think it's 200 slums in Nairobi. These are the slums that it's very easy for the ruling elite in Kenya, and actually easy for anyone who lives in Nairobi to drive past and somehow stop noticing. I used to live not far from Kibera, and I too stopped noticing it at a certain point. But this is where the new generation is growing up, and it illustrates the vast inequalities. This is my favorite photo, which I have on the wall of my study. I think this is right in the center of town. And I think it's such a wonderful illustration, wonderful and ghastly and magnificent and terrible, of the inequalities in a place like Nairobi. And there's a lot of anger in places like Kibera because people there are not eating, but they know that their leaders are in another way. And here in the West, at least, we need to make sure we don't make things worse for people living in places like that. Thank you very much.